Thank you, John, and thanks everybody for having us here. I wanted to start off, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really nice for our team to get a chance to share some of the work we've been doing together. I wanted to start off, if any of you were here in the spring, you might have heard a talk that my colleague Michael Warren and I gave, and I don't think I saw Michael in the room. But he and I spent the better part of this summer working on the negotiations leading up to the passage of a bill that extended California's cap-and-trade system. It's really intricately linked to the question of how the state climate policy is going and what needs to be done in the future to deliver on our ambitious goals. This is a project that sort of takes a step back to ask, as John suggested, how we're doing on the earlier stage of our climate policy project, to think both what we can learn from that experience, what we might do going forward, and to put in context, especially the role for that cap and trade program going forward, which is highly uncertain right now, and as we'll get to at the very end of the presentation, a key part of where the state's policy apparatus might be headed. So just for some context, I wanted to show a figure coming from the California Air Resources Board, which is the climate regulator in the state. The statewide target for the year 2020, which we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about, is to return emissions back to the levels they were at in 1990. This was set up by a bill called AB 32 that passed about 10 years ago in 2006. At the same time that bill was passed, there was an expression of support from Governor Schwarzenegger, who signed that bill into law. Just before the bill passed, he established a non-binding target of 80% below 1990 emissions levels by the year 2050. This is roughly in line with what the IPCC was saying would be required from advanced economies to stay on track for approximately a 2-degree warming limit for the planet as a whole. More recently, in 2016, the state legislature passed a bill called SB 32, intentionally named after AB 32, codifying a statewide target, a legally binding statewide target of 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030. That is a really big cut. And as the state begins to embark on the plan for how the state is going to get to that ambitious, globally ambitious goal, we wanted to take a step back and ask, how are we doing on the road to the more modest target, and what can we say about the experience to date, and what can we learn from that process going forward? So today we're going to talk mostly about one of 3 what are called scoping plans. The first scoping plan was prepared in 2008 by the Air Resources Board. These are the documents that describe the plan for how the state is going to achieve one of its many targets. The first 2 scoping plans were issued with respect to the 2020 target, and right now there is a planning process that's expected to conclude by the end of the year that will establish a plan for how California is going to get to that deep 2030 target. The big question you might want to ask is, if you look at the first scoping plan, it was published in December of 2008 when there were a few other things going on in the world. Most notably, well, I guess there's a lot of different things depending on your point of view, but the Great Recession was a huge impact from the standpoint of energy systems. The 2014 update included some of the impacts of the Great Recession, but didn't fully explain what was going on and how that impacted the state climate policy portfolio, which we'll talk about today. So just to orient people, I want to show a picture of the historical emissions back when that 2008 scoping plan was projected. The business as usual projections on the upper line, significantly increasing all the way to 2020. And then the target for the year 2020 implied with this downward trajectory. And that's the goal that was on the books, that is on the books, and the way that the scoping plan at the time thought about it. If you compare historical data since that time, I've plotted that here on the figure, you can see it's a little bit different than the older historical data, which is the first clue that something is going on. A lot of the data around greenhouse gas emissions change over time as we develop new ways of assessing what's actually been emitted, improving our inventories, changing our accounting systems. But perhaps most notably, you can see that the actual data, the experience through 2015, which is the most recent year of data that's available, has tracked significantly below the policy scenario. And so one interpretation of this would be to say, everything's great, we're totally on track. And I think in some respects we are on track, and it looks like it's very much within sight. But we wanted to drill down and get a better sense of what is actually causing these drivers of change and what we can learn from that process. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mike.
Great, thanks, Danny. Yeah, thank you all. And so what we want to run you through are 3 different analyses that we did to look at these kinds of questions that Danny is talking about. And we look at that in 2 different ways. One is, as Danny was talking about, to compare what's actually happened with how that was expected in the original scoping plan in particular. And then also to drill down into what are the factors that are driving the emissions reductions to date. Policies have certainly played a role, but also, as Danny mentioned, the recession has played a major role as well in affecting emissions from the time of the scoping plan to now. And there's also been some other surprises that weren't incorporated into that original scoping plan, but are reflected in terms of the actual emissions that we've seen. In particular, two that are relevant for energy systems are the major drought from the last few years that significantly impacted hydropower generation. And also in 2012, the San Onofre nuclear generating station, often called SONGS, shut down unexpectedly, and that basically cut nuclear generation in the state approximately in half. Both this reduced hydropower during the drought and then this decrease in nuclear generation led to increased natural gas use for electricity generation, and so higher emissions than would otherwise have been the case without those two events. In addition, there's been changes in energy prices, particularly natural gas, as well as changes in technology costs and other market forces that as well have affected emissions. And so we wanted to look at all of these different factors and say, how can we estimate some of their different contributions to where we are now? As Danny mentioned, really the goal of this is to say what are some lessons of what's working and what's not working so that we can inform successful strategies going forward. So we're going to talk about three related analyses, the first being a look at statewide greenhouse gas emissions across the whole economy. And so this figure is showing you how those break down across some major sectors. This is for 2015 data from the Air Resources Board, the most recent year that's available. Transportation is the biggest contributor to statewide emissions, and within that, LDVs, light-duty vehicles, cars, SUVs, the light trucks that people drive are a major contributor. Industrial emissions are also a major player, and then right behind that is electricity generation, which includes both the emissions associated with in-state electricity generation and also emissions associated with imported electricity, because California consumes more electricity than we generate in the state, so we also import from other parts of the West. There's other sectors like commercial and residential, heating and cooling. There's also non-energy greenhouse gases that are a part of the economy-wide emissions as tracked by the Air Resources Board, from agriculture. High GWP is potent greenhouse gases associated with refrigerants, for instance, and then also things like landfills. So we looked at both this economy-wide analysis and then also the specific sectors where there's been a lot of the policies targeted and also where there's been changes in emissions over this period, and that's then this LDV, light-duty vehicles sector, and electricity. So we'll talk about all three of those. So I'm going to talk first about this statewide analysis. One of the ways that we started with this retrospective was to do a simple Kaya-type decomposition. And if you haven't seen a decomposition before, essentially what it's doing is it's saying you can express, in this case, emissions on the left, greenhouse gases, in terms of several components that if you multiply them together, they will collapse back to greenhouse gases, but where those different components might evolve differently over time and where it's useful to look at them as drivers of emissions. In this case, we're looking at population, at GDP per capita, and then a measure of the greenhouse gas intensity of the economy, so greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP. You can look at how these things have changed in the past. You can also compare that to what was expected in these terms in the original scoping plan, and so compare actual versus expectations. And let me say that decomposition aficionados in the audience will notice there's no energy term here. That's for a couple of reasons. One is that California does not maintain an economy-wide energy use database, only for particular sectors. And also, as I mentioned before, there's non-energy greenhouse gases that are included in this analysis. When we get to the sectoral analyses, you'll see energy terms come in. Okay, so first we wanted to talk about how the expectations compare to reality in these different components. So here's the projection for population from the original scoping plan. And here's how population has actually evolved. We've seen slower than expected population growth, at least as was expected in that original scoping plan. There's a similar story with GDP. Here's the projection for GDP, but like Danny mentioned, one of the things that happened in terms of looking at this past scoping plan versus now, to make apples-to-apples comparisons, we have to adjust for some kinds of definitions and other methods that have changed over time. And one of the things that changed is our definition of GDP changed from the scoping plan time to now. And so more activities are now included in the definition of GDP than back at the time of the scoping plan. So we had to correct for that. And you can see that this higher black line is making that adjustment. We would have seen a higher projection if it was using the current definition of GDP. So that's what we can compare to what's actually happened. The black line that you see below shows the clear effect of the recession, where there was this dip in 2008 and 2009, and then recovery that's basically tracked at around the same kind of growth rate that was expected in the scoping plan, but basically delayed by 4 to 5 years. You don't see some kind of catching up that you might expect of a period of faster economic growth where it's catching up to that dashed line. Instead, it's more on a parallel track, which of course has significant implications for emissions, as we'll see. So finally, greenhouse gas intensity. Both of these lines are from that original scoping plan, and so both the business as usual and then the policy case with additional emissions reductions. In both cases, the plan expected that greenhouse gas intensity of the economy was going to decline over time, but faster in the policy case with more emissions reductions. Here's what we've actually seen, where the actual greenhouse gas intensity is kind of tracked in between those. So we're doing better than the business as usual, but it hasn't fallen as fast as was hoped for in that original scoping plan with all of the policies that were imagined. If you put these together, this is one representation of the full decomposition that I showed you, and this is showing year-to-year changes in greenhouse gases. That is the black triangles that you see, and then the colored bars are a way to represent the contribution of these 3 decomposition factors to those changes in emissions. There's lots of decomposition methods out there. The one that we're using here is the one that was used in the last IPCC report. If you look at the blue bars, that's the contribution of population. And you can see that we know population's been going up, and so that's been, all else being equal, a positive effect on emissions. The orange bars are the effect of GDP per capita, and you can see the clear effect of the recession there in the 2008 and 2009 bars that contributed to significant emissions reductions during that period, followed by a recovery after that. And then the gray bars are the effect of greenhouse gas intensity that, as we saw, has been going down, and so all else being equal would be contributing to emissions reductions. So this is how the actual changes in terms of these drivers have evolved. To really ask this question or answer this question of what is the effect of the recession versus policies and other factors, we need to compare back in a quantitative way to the projections from the scoping plan. And so that's what we're going to run through next, coming back to this figure that you saw before. And we wanted to walk you through the major steps of our analysis to show you 2 key comparisons that quantify those kinds of effects. So this is showing you again the 2 business as usual and policy trajectories from the scoping plan compared to how actual emissions are being tracked. The first thing we had to do, as we mentioned, is to adjust to put those original scoping plan trajectories into kind of modern terms, a harmonization step that adjusted down both of those trajectories a little bit. And then the next step that we took is to say, okay, well, we want to look at what is the effect of the recession. We know that that scoping plan expected a much higher growth in GDP. What if they had known what actual GDP was going to do? So let's hold all of the assumptions the same and just apply actual GDP to that same framework. What would their business as usual and policy cases have been? And that's what these orange lines show you, that basically if you had known what the actual GDP was going to be, lower than expected, both of those lines would have been much lower than they would otherwise have been. And then finally, we also wanted to adjust for those other surprises that I talked about, the shutdown of songs and also the drought, that are something that weren't incorporated into the planning in the scoping plan. They didn't know they were going to happen, but certainly they're reflected in the actual emissions that we've seen. And so those raise emissions a little bit compared with what they otherwise would have been. All of this allows us to make 2 key comparisons. So the first is if you compare that original business as usual line translated into modern terms with the line that's calculated using actual GDP, that can give you an estimate of the recession effect. And this is looking specifically at the latest year of data, 2015. In numerical terms, we estimate that to be around 56 million metric tons, that we're 56 million metric tons below that business as usual because of the recession. If you factor in songs and droughts and then compare to actual emissions, this also gives you a basis for saying that policies and market effects altogether have a roughly similar effect of around 63 million metric tons, again for 2015. So in terms of that business as usual compared with where we are now, one conclusion that this suggests is that the recession has contributed about half to that, and then policies and markets the other half. But to really understand what's kind of going on in the sectors and where the emissions are actually changing, you need to dig into some of those sectoral changes. And so I'm going to hand it over to Mason to talk about the sectoral analyses that we've done.
So first, I'll talk about the electricity sector. So this is a picture of the Songs nuclear plant that's about halfway between LA and San Diego. That shut down because of malfunction. So we did a decomposition of electricity that was like that for the whole economy, but with an extra term for energy, or the energy content of electricity. So we have these terms for population and GDP per person, and then we have a term with the electricity consumption per GDP. So that's an expression of how efficiently the economy is using electricity. And then a term for greenhouse gases per unit of electricity. So that's an expression of how clean the electricity is that the state is using. And so if we compare the historical emissions from electricity with these original expectations from that 2008 scoping plan, then the emissions in the solid black line are well below what had been hoped for even in this policy case. But the recession likely had a strong effect on the state's electricity emissions, because you'd expect, all else being equal, that when the economy slows down, people would consume less electricity. And so this is our estimate of how big of an effect the recession might have had if, all else being equal. And so you can see that the policy case shifts here to be much closer to the actual emissions that we've seen, but still the historical emissions are below this policy case. However, we have to keep in mind these other surprises about the shutdown of Songs and the drought that lowered hydroelectric generation and increased the reliance on natural gas. And both of those would contribute to higher emissions. So actually, the historical emissions have come out quite a bit below the policy case, factoring in all of these surprises. So overall, that would seem like really great news, but yes?
Can you just remind us what policy case means?
Policy case is what the Air Resources Board had projected would be the result of all of the policies that they had specified. So these are direct regulations along with effects of the cap and trade system that we have in California. And so they spelled out a whole bunch of different measures in the scoping plan and assigned specific emissions reductions to each of them. And that's how we then got from the business as usual trajectory that they spelled out to the policy case. And so to try to see how the state's emissions from electricity wound up coming out so much below this policy case, we can look at the greenhouse gas intensity of the electricity supply, for example. And this shows the expected greenhouse gas intensity in the business as usual and policy cases and in the historical data. So it's not surprising that they were expecting that the policy case would have lower greenhouse gas intensity. So they were projecting that the electricity system would clean up, and so we'd cut emissions in that way. And then if we apply these corrections for the effect of the Songs shutdown and the drought, then actually the greenhouse gas intensity of the electricity supply we'd expect to be higher than in those scenarios. And so still the historical greenhouse gas intensity is well below the policy case. And one way that, or the main way that these emissions have dropped is in cutting emissions from imported electricity. So California imports about 1/3 of its electricity. And so at the bottom here, it shows the coal-fired power plant electricity that we import. And then there's a smaller amount of other types of electricity that come from specific sources. And then we have a large portion of emissions that come from other kinds of electricity that are called unspecified, where they come into the state, but it's not it's not specified when they're imported where they were generated from. And so it's clear that there's been a cut in the emissions from coal-fired power plants. And so that's one way that we've achieved lower emissions, but it's limited how much we can achieve through that, because once we push those emissions to zero and we're not importing any more coal electricity, then we have to go toward other types of cuts that might be more difficult in order to keep the emissions from the electricity sector going down. And
the gray,
yeah.
why was the car happy with that big chunk of gray? And is anybody happy with that? That makes any sense in
You mean
Sacramento?
happy about not knowing where it's coming from?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's something they talk about, and then it hasn't been resolved yet. But yeah, and so I mean, but it still might appear that, you know, they're having success at cutting emissions from that sector. However, the big drop in emissions that you can see there around 2009 was because of a change in the accounting system for how they credited emissions from those sources. So some of the cuts may be real, but some may be illusory, and hopefully we'll wind up with a different accounting system or a different way of bidding in electricity where we don't wind up with significant unspecified electricity emissions. And we'll have a better idea of what's actually going on. So now I'll move on to light-duty vehicles. And here we did a decomposition as well with 5 terms. So in addition to population GDP, we have VMT per GDP. So this gives you an idea of how much people are driving given the state of the economy. Then we have energy per VMT, which is to do with vehicle efficiency, and greenhouse gases per unit of energy. So that tells you how clean the energy is that's powering the light-duty vehicles. And here we have a similar kind of comparison of the historical light-duty vehicle emissions to the original business as usual and policy case projections. And then given the recession, we can calculate what emissions might have been. And it shifts both the business as usual and policy cases down substantially so that the actual emissions are maybe halfway in between those 2 scenarios. And you can see at the end, the latest data point here is from 2015, and the emissions are going up significantly there. And so we dug in a bit more to see, you know, what's going on and what's driving that increase. So there's data from the state on the fuel consumption. It's for light-duty vehicles, it's almost all gasoline. There's very little diesel or electricity or hydrogen or natural gas. And with the economic recovery after the recession, and also with the drop of the price of oil in late 2014, there's been a strong increase in fuel consumption. So this line here actually goes through 2016 because there's more recent data available there. So you can see there's been a strong increase, and so light-duty vehicle fuel consumption is going in the wrong direction. And one reason for that is because people are driving more. So this is showing the vehicle miles traveled from light-duty vehicles, and this shows the original business as usual and policy case projections, and then what might have been expected, all else being equal, given the recession that we saw. And so vehicle miles traveled didn't drop nearly as much as you might expect given the recession, but we still think that there was an effect there. But it's complicated to say what's going on because there's also an effect of oil prices having reached all-time highs around 2008, dropping during the recession, going back up again, and then dropping again in 2014. So, and those kind of unprecedented volatility in the oil price is difficult to analyze and pull out the effect from. But it's clear that in the last few years, the vehicle miles traveled have been going up. So if we want to cut emissions from this sector, then we really need to focus on either ways of getting the vehicle miles traveled to go back down, or to clean up the energy they use, or make the vehicles a lot more efficient to be able to compensate for the rising VMT. And so in conclusion, on the statewide emissions, it does look like the state is on track to hit the 2020 target, but questions still remain about whether we'll actually hit it. And the recession seems to explain about half of the reductions from the business as usual trajectory, whereas about half is from policies and all these other effects such as energy prices. In the electricity sector, we can see that there's been a rapid decarbonization, a lowering of the emissions intensity of electricity. But on the other hand, a lot of the low-hanging fruit is already gone. And so further cuts in the future may be harder to achieve. And in the light-duty vehicle sector, we can see that emissions are trending in the wrong direction, going up instead of down. And overall, it could be that the policies have been less effective than was expected in the scoping plan.
All right. Thank you, Mason and Mike. With that, I want to talk about some of the implications of this work. So I think the first thing to say is that it's really important to keep in mind the ambition of the 2030 target. This plan to get to 2020 is both really ambitious in the sense that very few people have developed a policy structure and a goal like this, but the target for 2030 is much deeper. And I'm showing here just straight line trajectories from where we are in 2015 to the 2020 target, from 2020 to 2030. And if we started in 2015 and went straight to the 2030 target, the different rates of emission reductions that would be required. And it's about 6 times as fast as we're going right now if we started right now to get to 2030, and it's about 9 times as fast if we waited until we hit 2020 right on the dot and try to go to 2030 from there. The reason this matters is because nobody can project 10 to 15 years forward in the energy system accurately. Nobody can. I'll assert that. And we're not trying to pick on the regulator for making long-term projections. Rather, anyone trying to plan for a target like this is going to have to make projections that are necessarily uncertain and are almost certainly going to be wrong. And it's important to be able to have real-time ways of diagnosing the structure of what's expected and adjusting the plans as needed to go forward. The 2008 scoping plan it's an important document. It's the first comprehensive statewide climate plan, but it's also not the most quantitatively rigorous thing. In fact, most of the numbers are in a single table. There were lots of thoughts that went into how to structure these scenarios we presented, but not a lot of formal quantitative modeling. It's actually very difficult to work with. The good news is that for the scoping plan that the regulator is developing for 2030, they're using a very sophisticated quantitative modeling tool called Pathways that was developed by the consultancy E3. This is going to be a great model with good output that's going to allow real-time analysis using decomposition methods to track the state's progress and to account for surprises as they happen in real time. And that's an important innovation. One of the challenges as we think about trying to get to 2030, reflecting on what Mike and Mason shared, is the role of different policies in the state's draft scoping plan. This is a figure from the draft scoping plan that shows the cumulative reductions the regulator expects from 2021 to 2030. And they say it's going to take about 680 million tons cumulative in terms of reductions against a baseline to get to a scenario that's consistent with this target for 2030. Now again, nobody knows that with precision, but the regulator is calculating it with precision for the purposes of their planning exercise. When you look at the measures that are under consideration, the vast majority of them continue to be regulatory measures. A lot of people think of California as having a market-based climate policy structure. Most of the regulations and policies are traditional regulatory instruments or performance standards. I've highlighted 3 of them here that in light of recent changes may cause a shift in the direction of a market-based policy. The first one I've circled, the top one, is the short-lived climate pollutant strategy, which accounts for a little over 200 million of the cumulative reductions that are expected. About half of that comes from reductions of hydrofluorocarbons, gases that are used for refrigeration and insulation and other purposes like that. Unfortunately, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals just struck down EPA's authority to replace these HFC gases with lower climate polluting alternatives. That case is on appeal. But right now, the structure by which California was planning to regulate the sector is very much in doubt and uncertain. So there's a question mark around a big part of the state's scoping plan strategy. Similarly, the number below that, 67 million tons, comes from reductions in the mobile source sector. That includes the light-duty vehicles we talked about, as well as others. The traditional regulatory mechanism California has used is a waiver from the federal government to exceed the federal standards for emissions from these vehicles. Under the Trump administration, almost everyone agrees that waiver is not forthcoming. There are standards in place through 2025 for LDVs, but the extra steps that are going to be required in the later years of the program are currently looking not legally feasible, although we'll see what happens in the future with that. And finally, there's a little contribution of 30 million tons from a measure that was contemplated that would have applied to the oil refineries. In the cap and trade negotiations, this is one of the measures that the industry extracted as a concession. The regulator will not be able to use this measure. So all told, a number of these policy changes or uncertainties around the legal authorities around the regulatory instruments suggest a larger role for the cap and trade system. And the figure on the right, the bar chart on the right, shows a slightly larger role for the cap and trade system under what the regulator is calling an uncertainty scenario, where for some reason some of these policies don't add up. I think that's a much more realistic outlook given the political and legal challenges in implementing the structure that had been considered. That in turn leads to maybe the most important policy consideration if you think about the trends that Mike and Mason talked about. So what I'm doing here is I want to compare the cumulative volume of supply and demand in the carbon market. And I'll start on the far left here, the scoping plan scenario. This is the demand from the cap and trade market, the contribution that the regulator says it needs from the cap and trade market to deliver on that 2030 target. There's a low bar at 190 million for its standard scenario, and a higher bar up near 342 million for the uncertainty scenario. Unfortunately, the cap and trade program that just got extended has what's called a significant oversupply condition. There are more allowances in the program because the caps were set high before the recession was taken into account, and there's all of these extra allowances in the system. A colleague, Chris Bush, who works at the think tank Energy Innovation, wrote a really excellent paper in April of this year trying to quantify the extent of oversupply in the system, and he calculates oversupply numbers that are roughly the size of the contribution that the regulator expects from the program. In other words, there's that many extra allowances in the program through 2020 that can be available for future use, and that's about the same size as what the regulator hopes the market will reduce in the next decade of the program's future. Managing this oversupply problem is going to be really critical if we want emissions to fall, particularly if the regulatory instruments the state has thus far relied on do not work, are not legally feasible, are not politically feasible. But unfortunately, unless that problem is dealt with, the cap and trade program won't be binding. Companies will be able to comply by using these extra allowances, and emissions won't fall as fast as the program might suggest. The interesting news about all this, and this is just a picture of Chris Bush's report, which I recommend to folks, is the cap and trade bill, AB 398, which extended this program, also includes a provision that requires the regulator to look into, to evaluate and address, as appropriate, concerns related to overallocation in the program. And you should be keeping a close eye on this. The regulator is planning a workshop in just a couple of weeks, a week and a half, where we believe they're going to be giving the first preview of how their post-2020 carbon market design, how this cap and trade program, what it will look like, and whether or not it will address this oversupply problem. And so if you're convinced that there's a risk that these regulatory measures are not going to be sufficient to get us where we want to go, if you're concerned about uncertainty, it's going to be really important to keep an eye on this oversupply problem. Just to put another quantitative point on this, the extent of the oversupply looks like the program could operate on these extra allowances into the early 2020s, perhaps the mid-2020s, before it becomes binding. And that means a situation where we're not reducing emissions nearly as fast as we need. And in fact, there's so many right now that if these light-duty vehicle emissions were to ratchet way up, right, and I don't think it's necessarily a concern, but if the emissions went way up, the cap and trade program wouldn't bind in such a way that the 2020 target would be guaranteed. So the design of the cap and trade program and the way this program gets implemented is absolutely critical to the structure of the state's climate policy and fits in really, really nicely with this question of how we track and monitor the plans that the state makes going forward. So with that, we'd love to take any questions you guys have. Thanks. Sure.
The grid cleanliness or the degree of emissions from the electricity grid, does that take into account the recent court ruling for imported photovoltaic cells?
I don't know. So it's just taking the data we have, and the state's inventory tracks all of the imports. and all of the exports right now. So I believe it does, but I don't know the specifics with respect to that case.
I'm a bit hung up on the graph with the blue, gray, and green. Does CARB actually not know what the energy mix is?
Oh, the electricity system?
Yeah.
So a lot of the deliveries are what are called unspecified. And think of it like a mortgage, like a chain of title. Who owns your house? The bank owns the house, and then they securitize it and they sell it. You want to file that chain of title. Because the electricity system, the physical system, is operated differently from the legal and economic contractual piece of the system, it's actually sometimes not possible to trace that chain of title back to an owner. There are processes in place to improve this a little, but some of the electricity, in fact, if you live in SoCal Edison, if you live down in Southern California territory, that number could be 35% or so right now. So it's a lot.
The gray could be all coal, it could be all gas.
It literally means we don't know. And it's treated as though it has the emissions factor approximately of natural gas, but we don't know what it is by definition.
So were these CO2 numbers reported along with the electricity, or are those inferred CO2 numbers?
Yeah, so we're showing the inventory data, which is the emissions data. They do calculate the power flows, and then what they do, if you have a specified power plant, so if you know it's a coal plant, you apply that coal plant emission factor. If you know it's a gas plant, same thing. For the gray bar, we don't know what it is, and there's a default emissions parameter that's applied to it.
Do you realize, were you taking account of the fact that California does not regulate its methane leakage and emissions well at all? And that the Aliso Canyon gas leak, for instance, caused by the CPUC and DOGGR, wiped out all benefit of all California wind and solar ever installed in 4 months. Now, the leakage, they reported after this, that the leakage annually in California of methane from fracking, through piping, through storage, through burning, is more than that. So we might as well sell our wind and solar somewhere else and figure out how to actually regulate methane leakage, right? Are you taking that into account? It's
So
a huge factor.
we are looking only at the inventory data, which do not include the leaks. And so when I teach climate issues, what I say to people is you only see what you measure in the inventory, right? And your criticism is well taken. If we're not measuring real things, we're not seeing real things. I don't think that council's saying nothing we're doing in renewables is relevant. Actually, quite the opposite. But I hear you loud and clear. The state claims, and I'm not following this closely, but they're going to require equal ton-for-ton mitigation of the methane leak from Aliso Canyon. And if they do that right, I haven't looked into it, that would, I think, account for the concerns you have.
So are you aware of the California Council, the 2011 report by the California Council on Science and Technology about what to do for California's energy plan?
Yeah. I mean, we've also looked at that, absolutely.
So
and just to, on the
aware
Aliso
that-
Canyon, so I think the most recent version of the inventory is the first one, where they've separately tracked what you can associate with Aliso Canyon. It's not part of the numbers that you're seeing here. It's not part of the current inventory. They're talking about ways to account for that, but that's all an open conversation right
So
now.
would you buy a self-driving car that was programmed to run the way this?
I'll be happy to take that offline, yeah.
Okay, let's do one more up here and then go to that.
So, given the songs thing, where's the Diablo Canyon shutdown fit into stuff?
So that's planned, hasn't happened yet, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at the 2030 plan that's being developed right now, that is factored in, and there's an estimate for when that would happen, and potentially another increase in natural gas associated electricity generation to make up for that. Yeah.
In the back corner.
To oversimplify the story I heard here, transportation is the big story in California, and it's going in the wrong direction. And I wonder if from the price of fuel, you can extract the cost of fuel that we would need to fix that, whether it's implemented through cap and trade or a more rational system where you actually price those emissions. What would it be? I mean, that ought to be in the data, and I don't remember you indicating how expensive it would be to fix it.
Well, there's different prices that might be involved. There's the price that would make people drive less. There's the price that would make other other energy forms be more competitive, like hydrogen, but that would be a lot higher than the price that would be required to make people drive less.
Yeah, but you have, what I'm trying to say is I think in your data is some empirical evidence of the short-term elasticity of the market.
Yeah, it's one thing that we started to look into trying to quantify, but it seemed complicated because most of the methods rely on comparing what's happened recently with some other historical period in order to get an elasticity, but then there isn't really a comparable historical event to the kinds of things that we've seen in the last 10 years.
But I meant the projections. If you were just to compare what really happened with projections, can you infer what the role of the lower price of gasoline was on these?
I mean, it would be great if we could come up with a way of estimating it, and so I'd love to talk to you about it more to see if we can come up with a relatively transparent way of doing that, because then we could factor that out as one of the factors that's affecting things and narrow down what the effect of the state's climate policies have been.
Yeah, you could parameterize the elasticity. So it seems like you have steps. Since there's no perfect analogous period, you could just do the range. Wow, let's go back to a couple of students.
So I have two, but one of them's really, really fast. So my first one, and I'm not sure if this was covered because I couldn't really hear what the first question was, but does the CO2 emissions calculations from imported electricity take into account the energy that's lost during transit and the,
Yes, yes.
that's it? Okay, awesome. Thanks. And then also I was wondering, I don't know if this is something that people have studied, I mean I'm sure it is, but because of the affordable housing crisis, I know that's one of the factors that's causing commute times to increase by a lot. And so I was wondering whether like affordable housing and smart growth policy would potentially really help curb that huge growth in transportation emissions, and if that's something that policymakers have been looking into.
Yeah, so there's that's an explicit part of the planning process. There's also a separate policy called SB 375, which structures a way to think about reducing basically demand for transportation and growth, not necessarily connected to affordable housing, but it's obviously related. There are people also who think that the high cost of living in California is causing people to leave, right? And then there's leakage, if you will, of emissions associated with people who would live here if it were cheaper, but don't anymore. So it is very complicated to answer these questions. This is really, and to just go back to the last question, you need to start with an analysis like this to begin to ask the really interesting questions. And that's the stuff certainly we'll be thinking about next.
Let's go up here and then back and then around to Jeff Byron.
Is there any discussion on also including like embodied energy in like consumption and stuff like that? It's way more difficult to have that data, but is anyone talking about that at all? Not the direct emissions?
Yeah, I mean, there is this inconsistency in the way that they account for things, where they do count the emissions from imported electricity, but they don't count the emissions from imported biofuels or all the other products that we buy. And so in some ways it would be better if we were doing a consistent accounting, but yeah, it would be a really big undertaking.
Just to add, I mean, this is one of the most sophisticated inventories of greenhouse gases in the world, and you might also look at it and say it's simplistic relative to the conversation in a university like this. That's the state of the world, right? And if you want to make it different, there's a whole bunch of issues in practice that we're just not up to speed on.
On the transport sector, I understand the focus was on light-duty vehicles because they're sort of the largest share of the emissions. But did you have a sense, or did you look at all about the other vehicles? Are they also on an upward trend in terms of emissions, or do you have anything to say about those?
Yeah, heavy-duty vehicles are definitely increasing. But there's also been a lot of use of biodiesel there. And so depending on how you account for that, then that's helping reduce emissions. So it's kind of complicated where California uses two different accounting systems for biofuels. So in all the data we've been showing from the main greenhouse gas inventory, they just treat biofuels as being completely zero emissions. But then they have another system that puts a price on liquid fuels, the low carbon fuel standard, and there they use a full life cycle emissions accounting. And so then the emissions from biodiesel are much, much higher and much closer to regular diesel.
Ken has a three-finger and then Jack and back up here.
Is anybody contemplating or doing a parallel analysis that would use a consumption-based analysis to address this?
This is consumption based. I mean, this is what?
No, imported goods. We're importing goods and services.
I think,
With a body car.
so people definitely talk about this, Ken, but again, most people sort of like pale and fall over when they look at the 2030 target for what we're doing. It's hard enough. So in terms of the policy apparatus, people are really focused on trying to solve the challenge that's in front of us. And those are things that make life a lot harder. It's not that we shouldn't do it, it's just that much harder.
Again, you could do is around your basic kind of set of benchmarks. Yeah.
Could you comment on the effect of the increased volume of electric vehicles on reducing the emissions, especially with daytime charging using the excess PV electricity?
So far, it doesn't really have much of an effect on the data that you see here. But then,
how much do we need to increase it before it becomes appreciable?
it becomes appreciable after 2020. So looking at the targets for 2030, then EVs definitely play a big role in emissions cuts. And then after that, through 2050, they're expected to play a really, really big role.
So in this plan that you see up there now, a big part of the transportation part of that is not just vehicle efficiency, but also a large ramp up in EVs as well.
Okay, let's squeeze in Jeff Byron. I promised him.
So gentlemen, excellent analysis. I think policymakers will be really informed by this. But back to the oversupply of credits, who's got them? And have you thought about how legislators and regulators can claw some of those back?
Yeah, so it's a mixture. It's actually a really complicated to answer who's got them. A lot of them haven't been introduced into the market, but are scheduled to be introduced into the market. Some of them are guaranteed to be introduced into the market in the future. Some of them were offered and went unsold and are in a limbo account. So there's a complex set of explanations we can talk about if you're interested. There are several solutions. You could lower the future caps. Some people talk about linking that to, I'd point you to the northeastern states' RGGI, their carbon market, has just implemented a process to deal with, frankly, an oversupply in their conditions. And there's a number of proxies out there for how you can reduce caps while keeping people who currently hold the instruments whole. And I think that's the most important part of the discussion in the carbon market design that needs to be addressed next, now that the legal authority for the program is secure for the next 10 plus years.
I'm going to squeeze in a bit and then back for Lester and then back.
So, very nice analysis. If you were to look at now, what should we do in the future on the transportation side? And if you were to bring the emissions back on track, which was sort of the original plan, what are in your mind, what are the biggest levers we have? Is it a major investment in public transportation? Is it something else, or is it a carbon tax on fuel? I mean, I'm just trying to see if I were a policymaker, what would I be looking for to have the biggest difference?
Let me just say one thing. The first thing is to be transparent about your assumptions and to model that question. And so we're mostly interested in asking that question of analytically, what are your options? And then tracking what we do relative to what we said we would do. That's the first thing. What the bottom line is, I mean, I'm part of this exercise we did, we wrote a comment letter a couple of months back with Michael Wara on these issues. And the EV penetration matters a lot more closer to 2035 than today from a GHG perspective, because the grid will hopefully be much cleaner by then. I'm kind of agnostic, and for me, the biggest concern is I don't believe forecasts that are 10 years out. I think we need to do them to plan, but to assume we know what the demographic conditions are going to be, what housing is going to look like 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road, and assume that that's true and plan everything from it without ever revisiting those assumptions, that's what worries me most.
But if I'm a policymaker in Sacramento right now, I need to make some decisions. I need to make some bets. What would I do?
Well, I think it's important to look at the plans of what they're saying they're going to do. And as Danny's saying, this is really a kind of a risk management then exercise going forward. And so they're expecting, as we were just talking about, that they need a very large ramp up in EVs or other kinds of zero emissions vehicles. And that's a question of whether that's going to materialize or not. And then there's all these questions, as Danny raised, of what will happen with vehicle efficiency as well.
Yeah, so California's constrained on what it can do with vehicle efficiency because of the federal standards and not being able to go beyond those standards through 2026. So, or given these issues with waivers that Danny brought up earlier, and so then it seems that the state would need to do a lot more on encouraging lower efficiency through other means rather than a direct efficiency standard. So they could give incentives for electric cars, and then there's the low carbon fuel standard, which is scheduled to reduce emissions significantly. And so if they can keep that going, then it would make a big contribution. So far, it hasn't really done very much, and so then it's not clear.
On a related note, we had two important announcements this week. Governor Brown announced that he was considering a 2030 phase out of sales of new gas cars, right? So no new gas car sales after 2030. And Mary Nichols, the head of CARB, echoed that. And then we also had an announcement from Assembly Member Phil Ting, who said he was planning to introduce legislation next year that would phase out sales of new gas cars by 2040. So my question is, when the draft scoping plan, will it be finalized? When it's finalized, will it take into account these possibilities in its analyses or not?
So that'll be left up to the regulator to decide, but they have a statutory deadline to finish it by the end of this year. And I think given the amount of scrutiny and potential litigation from opponents, it's unlikely that they would radically reorient their analysis to these potential developments. So I would expect that's something we'll want to track over time rather than look for in a final plan, which is, again, one of the reasons why you want to study these plans, because if we lock into something that no longer matches what we're actually doing, we need to be in conversation about that.
Related to that, can I just ask, have they looked at the difference between what California is currently doing with a 100% renewable standard as opposed to clean energy standard that just drives towards zero emissions? Have they looked at that as a alternative policy?
We could talk about that more. The only policy that you see measured here is the current renewables portfolio standard. There's discussion of transitioning it to a zero carbon standard in a bill called SB 100. It's not in this. Could be, but it's not.
Our speaker next week, Red Roaring, thanks to skillful planning by Mary, is going to talk about electric sector reorganization and reform. His firm actually developed the Pathways model, which is this one that's new and improved and much better than our speakers to use for this phase 2 analysis. We can allow during the question and answer period some of these redos on voice elasticities. So with that, thank you for doing the presentation.